Listening to the Critical Hour. I'm Wilmer Leon. I'm joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Aaron Mate has a piece entitled, "In Lebanon Carnage, Biden Deepens U.S. So-Called Obligation to Israeli Aggression." Israel has killed Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah, emboldening a U.S.-backed war for hegemony in which Arab civilians are an open Israeli target. For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Morris Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled Armed Struggle: Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So Aaron Mate writes, recently, President Biden was asked if fueling a Middle East conflict on top of the proxy war in Ukraine was, quote, more than the U.S. can take on at the same time, end quote. No, Biden shot back. We're the United States of America, for God's sake, the most powerful nation in the history of the world. Not only does the U.S. have the capacity to do this, we have the obligation. We are an essential nation, and if we don't, then who does? That explains it all, Dr. Horne. That warped mindset, this whole thing of essential nation, manifest destiny, all of those often used tropes explains it all. And with this, Biden gave Netanyahu the green light to continue with genocide. Dr. Joe Horne.
It also exposes the inevitable connection between settler colonialism in North America, the heavyweight champion of this genre, and settler colonialism in historic Palestine. It's no secret that the attacks on Hezbollah, the assassination of Mr. Nasrallah, were a joint U.S.-Israeli enterprise. We can say the same with regard to the dropping of the mother of all bombs on a residential apartment building in downtown Beirut in order to wipe out Mr. Nasrallah and his comrades, not to mention what the New York Times referenced this morning. That is to say that the National Security Agency of the United States of America, that global dragnet, which amongst other so-called accomplishments was bugging the mobile phone of former German Chancellor Angela Merkel, has also been sharing intelligence with Israel with regard to the locale of Mr. Nasrallah and his comrades. And indeed, one could say the same for the other member states of NATO, particularly the Federal Republic of Germany. We can also say that with regard to the crime against humanity, the violation of international law that took place in the last week or so when pagers and walkie-talkies and solar panels were detonated, not only harming and maiming Hezbollah militants, but also their families and innocent civilians, we can also say that we have crossed the Rubicon. And it's a matter of time before the Internet of Things, that is to say, thermostats, laptops, automobiles, all tied to the Internet, become vehicles for bombs and detonations. Along that line, we should also envision, I'm afraid to say, another violation of international law. That is to say, we can easily envision the deployment of robot soldiers. Those who recall the now forgotten film RoboCop can now easily envision the deployment of robot soldiers who, like their masters in Washington, do not have a conscience. In fact, the robots might have more of a conscience than their masters in Washington, believe it or not. We can also expect, I'm afraid to say, an impending attack on Iran. Iran is the big enchilada. The Israelis are trying to induce an Iranian counterreaction that would lead those U.S. ships and the flotilla in that part of planet Earth to launch military assaults on the Islamic Republic. We can also expect the continuing undermining of the so-called reformist leadership just elected in Iran and the rise to power of those who are more willing to confront the Zionist entity and their master in Washington. And as well, this could easily lead to a breakout, a nuclear breakout by Iran. That is to say, the progressive development of nuclear weaponry, which could move this small planet closer to a nuclear midnight. We should also expect that since Hezbollah has been weakened, and yet it was essential to combating the so-called Sunni extremists, not least in its own backyard in Lebanon, but also in neighboring Syria, we can expect a more robust attack by these forces that Hezbollah was previously combating, speaking of the so-called Sunni extremists, including al-Qaeda, because we know that in Syria, there has been a kind of de facto alliance, not only involving the United States and Israel, but to a certain degree, Ankara, the Turks as well. Therefore, it's easy to envision an escalation in neighboring Syria, which could move us closer to opening the gates of hell. In this regard, pay attention to any readouts from the meeting in Washington just a few days ago between the leader of the United Arab Emirates and Mr. Biden in the Oval Office. I was quite disappointed that there was not a more militant protest against his arrival in Washington, speaking of MBZ, the leader of the UAE, because we all know that they're playing an increasingly muscular role in Africa, a detrimental role, particularly in Sudan, where they're a major funder, according to the New York Times in a recent story, of the so-called rapid support forces, which have plunged this nation in the heart of Africa into famine, into a refugee crisis that is putting enormous strain on its neighbors, including Libya, Egypt, Chad, Ethiopia, the Central African Republic, etc. We should also expect with this weakening of Iran very damaging consequences in Lebanon itself. Many of us are old enough to recall when these so-called right-wing fascist phalanges, Christian militias, were running roughshod in Lebanon, of course, allied with Israel. We all recall the massacres in Sabra and Shatila, the massacres in refugee camps, in which Israel was complicit. That led directly to the rise of Hezbollah. As Hezbollah is weakened, you can easily envision the rise once again of these right-wing Christian elements, not to mention, as aforementioned, the Sunni extremists as well. Likewise, we know that Hezbollah was comprised heavily of Shia forces in Lebanon, and of course, backed by a heavily Shia regime in Iran. The Shias historically have been the underdog. Curiously enough, Israel and the United States have been trying to weaken this underdog as they embolden Christian phalangist fascists and embolden Sunni extremists. This does not bode well. And we also know that Iran is seen as a kind of domino. I'm sure you gentlemen are familiar with the recently commissioned bipartisan congressional report authorized by Democrats and Republicans on Capitol Hill. The commission co-chaired by former State Department honcho Eric Edelman, former U.S. ambassador to Turkey, and former Microsoft executive Mariah Sixkiller, which envisions the United States spending more, believe it or not, on the military, because it said that Iran is part of the key to bringing to heel Russia, China, and North Korea. So do not expect this conflict to stay cited exclusively in West Asia. Expect it to spread like an out-of-control oil spill. To that extent, expect more commando raids, that is to say, violations of international law by the Israelis as they seek to soften up their opposition forces of Hezbollah in Lebanon and the al-Assad regime in Syria. This may be the preparation for an all-out invasion. With regard to Washington, we know that Mr. Trump has been miffed at Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu because Mr. Netanyahu, in November 2020, sent a congratulatory message to the victor, Mr. Biden, when Mr. Trump was saying the election was rigged. So expect Mr. Netanyahu to seek to compensate by creating a nasty October surprise for the Democrats, which it is hoped and envisioned by himself and his comrades that this will ease the path of a return of Mr. Trump to the White House in January 2025. And of course, we all know that during his ill-fated administration, Mr. Trump helped to authorize the Abraham Accords, a gift, a bouquet to the Israeli right-wingers, which at the same time softened up the regime in Sudan, leading to this current crisis there. He moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. He authorized the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian leader. And as well, I think it's important for those in your audience to recognize that, yes, these boneheaded, harebrained policies are the figment of the febrile imaginations of Biden and Harris and Trump. But it's more than that. It comes inevitably, once again, from the dictates of settler colonialism, deeply embedded in the United States of America, deeply embedded in Israel itself. And therefore, what that means is that those who are opposed to those policies, in addition to organizing domestically, must perforce organize globally.
Additionally, we've got about 3 minutes left. Airstrikes in Khartoum as Sudan army attacks paramilitary positions. Your thoughts on the current conflict in Sudan?
Well, as noted, this tragedy was easily foreseeable. It comes in the first instance, I'm afraid to say, from the fact that the previous regime in Khartoum, Sudan, was forced to ink the so-called Abraham Accords, which also called for a major kind of reparations to alleged victims of that regime in the Israeli state and in the United States of America. As noted, the United Arab Emirates and the other allies of Washington, the so-called Gulf Arab states, are playing a very devastating and negative role in Sudan, for example. And so, therefore, in order to bring this conflict to some sort of resolution, there's going to have to be pressure on the UAE. There's going to have to be pressure on those who are funding the forces that are driving Sudan into the ditch, not least by sending in weapons. I'm sure you gentlemen saw that article in the New York Times where it suggested that the UAE had supposedly built a hospital in neighboring Chad to deal with victims of the genocide, and I do not use that term loosely, unfolding in Sudan, but they were also using it as a cover for sending weapons into Sudan as well. This must stop. It's going to require more militancy on this side of the Atlantic than we've seen thus far.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.